"She's finally at peace now," Diana whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as we stood beside my father's open casket. Her performance was flawless, the grieving widow dressed in elegant black, her voice trembling with just the right amount of sorrow. But I wasn't watching her tears, I was watching her hands, the same hands that had stirred my father's tea every morning for the past 3 years, the same hands that had slowly, methodically poisoned him to death, while I stood helplessly on the sidelines, believing every lie she told. My name is Natalie, and I was 28 years old when I buried my father. But this story isn't about grief, it's about the moment I looked into my stepmother's eyes at his funeral, and finally understood that the woman who had destroyed my family was about to face the consequences she never saw coming. Let me take you back to where it all began. When I was 14 years old, my mother Margaret was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She fought for 8 months, but the disease was relentless, and I watched the strongest woman I ever knew fade away in a hospital bed, holding my hand until her very last breath. My father Richard was devastated. They had been married for 20 years, high school sweethearts who still held hands in public, and danced in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. When she died, a part of him died too, and I became his whole world. We clung to each other through those first terrible years, eating dinner together every night, taking walks in the park where Mom used to feed the ducks, celebrating holidays quietly, just the two of us wrapped in our shared memories of her. My father was a successful real estate developer, and after Mom passed he threw himself into his work building shopping centers and apartment complexes across Texas. His company was worth about $12 million, and he had investments, properties and savings that brought his total estate to nearly $18 million. He wasn't flashy about his wealth. We lived in a nice house, drove reasonable cars, and he donated generously to cancer research in my mother's name. But everyone in our social circle knew Richard Coleman was a wealthy man, and apparently so did Diana Mitchell. Diana entered our lives when I was 17, exactly 3 years after Mom died. My father met her at a charity gala for the Children's Hospital. She was 38 years old, beautiful in a polished, calculated way, with auburn hair and green eyes that could shift from warm to cold in an instant. She worked as an interior designer, she said, specializing in luxury homes, and she had a gift for making my father feel alive again. I watched him laugh at her jokes, reach for her hand across dinner tables, and slowly emerge from the fog of grief that had surrounded him for years. I should have been happy for him. I wanted to be happy for him, but something about Diana made my skin crawl from the very first moment. It started with small things, the way she would compliment me in front of my father, but shoot me cold looks when his back was turned, the subtle comments about how I was getting old enough to be more independent, how college would be such an exciting adventure for me so far away from home. When I tried to talk to my father about my concerns, he dismissed them gently, saying Diana was just trying to find her place in our family and I should give her a chance. I loved my father more than anything, so I tried. I really did, but Diana didn't want to find her place in our family. She wanted to take it over completely. They got married when I was 18 in a lavish ceremony that Diana planned down to the smallest detail. I was the maid of honor, smiling in photos while my stomach churned with unease. My mother's photos had been quietly removed from the living room, replaced with Diana's carefully curated artwork. My mother's garden was dug up to make room for Diana's modern sculpture collection. Piece by piece, memory by memory, my mother was being erased from the home she had built, and my father didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't want to see. I left for college that fall, grateful for the escape. I chose a university in California as far from Texas as I could reasonably get, telling myself I needed independence, but really I just couldn't stand watching Diana remake my childhood home in her own image. I called my father every week at first, but Diana was always there, always listening, always steering the conversation away from anything meaningful. Slowly the calls became less frequent, my visits became shorter and more uncomfortable, and the distance between my father and me grew wider every year. I blamed myself for not trying harder, but I know now that Diana was engineering that distance, deliberately isolating my father from anyone who might question her control over him. When I was 23, I graduated with a degree in forensic accounting, a career choice that would later prove ironically useful. I moved to Chicago, started working for a financial crimes investigation firm, and began building my own life. I had a small apartment, a job I loved, and eventually I met Ethan, a kind, gentle architect who proposed on our 2-year anniversary. I was happy, genuinely happy for the first time since my mother died, but underneath that happiness was a constant gnawing worry about my father. Something was wrong. I could feel it in our increasingly rare phone calls, the way his voice sounded tired and confused, the way Diana always seemed to answer his phone and speak for him. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 5 years ago when I flew home for Thanksgiving. My father was 53 years old, and had always been robust and healthy, a man who played golf every weekend and could outwork employees half his age. But the man who greeted me at the airport was a shadow of himself. He had lost at least 20 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His hands trembled when he hugged me, and his eyes had a foggy, distant quality that terrified me. "Daddy, what happened to you?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Diana appeared beside him before he could answer. "Just some digestive issues," she said smoothly. "The doctors are running tests. You know how it is at this age, things start to break down." She laughed, but her eyes were watching me, carefully gauging my reaction. I didn't believe her for a second, but when I tried to get my father alone to talk, he seemed confused about what I was asking. Diana had an answer for everything. She had convinced him that his symptoms were normal aging, that the doctors were monitoring him closely, that there was nothing to worry about. Over the next 3 years, I watched my father deteriorate with terrifying speed. The symptoms were strange and inconsistent. Sometimes he seemed almost normal, alert and engaged, able to hold a conversation about his business or ask about my life. Other times he was barely coherent, forgetting my name, confusing me with my mother, stumbling over his words like a man twice his age. The doctors, Diana claimed, were baffled. They tested him for everything from early onset dementia to rare autoimmune diseases, but nothing conclusive ever emerged. Diana controlled all his medical information, claiming she didn't want to burden me with the details. I begged her to let me speak with his doctors directly, but she always had an excuse. "They're running new tests right now. The specialist is on vacation. I don't want to overwhelm him with too many people involved in his care. Let me handle this, Natalie. That's what wives are for." But I wasn't just worried about his health, I was worried about his money. During one of my visits, I discovered that Diana had convinced my father to add her name to all his accounts, to give her power of attorney over his financial affairs, to change his will so that she would inherit everything when he died. When I confronted her about it, she smiled that cold reptilian smile and said, "Your father trusts me to take care of things. He's not well enough to manage his affairs anymore. Surely you can see that." I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to somehow break through the web of lies she had spun around my father. But what could I do? He was an adult. He had made these decisions himself, and Diana had spent years positioning herself as his devoted caregiver, while I was the distant daughter who had abandoned him for a life in Chicago. The last time I saw my father alive was 6 months before he died. I had flown in for his 58th birthday, and the change in him was devastating. He barely recognized me, calling me Margaret several times and asking when Mom was coming home. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a fork. Diana fed him like a child, cooing softly about how she was taking such good care of him. I stayed for 3 days, sleeping in my old bedroom, listening through the walls as Diana moved around the house at odd hours. I heard her in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. doing something I couldn't identify. Through the walls in the morning, my father's tea would be waiting for him, specially prepared by Diana with a blend of herbs she claimed helped with his symptoms. I watched him drink it, watched her watch him drink it, and felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach that something was very, very wrong. I started researching. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first, just typing my father's symptoms into medical databases. Late at night, fatigue, weight loss, confusion, tremors, memory problems. The results pointed to dozens of possible conditions, but one kept appearing in my searches again and again: heavy metal poisoning, specifically chronic arsenic exposure. The symptoms matched perfectly: the gastrointestinal problems, the neurological decline, the characteristic pattern of improvement and relapse. Arsenic poisoning was slow, insidious, almost impossible to detect unless you knew to look for it, and Diana would have known. She had worked for an interior designer for years, and older paints, treatments, and preservation chemicals often contained arsenic compounds. She would know exactly how to obtain it, how to administer it, and how to make it look like natural illness. I took my suspicions to the police and was politely dismissed without a shred of evidence. An accusation of poisoning against my father's devoted wife would go nowhere. The detective I spoke with told me gently that I was probably processing my grief about my father's illness in unhealthy ways, and suggested I see a therapist. I left the station humiliated but more determined than ever. If the police wouldn't help me, I would gather the evidence myself. The next 6 months were a nightmare of helpless watching and secret investigation. I couldn't prove anything while my father was alive, couldn't get access to his medical records, couldn't examine the tea Diana prepared for him. Every morning I tried to convince him to see an independent doctor, but Diana had isolated him so completely that he trusted no one but her. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to dig into Diana's background, and what he found made my blood run cold. Diana Mitchell wasn't even her real name. She had been born Diane Kowalski in Ohio, and had been married twice before my father. Her first husband had died of a mysterious illness 12 years ago, leaving her a modest inheritance. Her second husband had divorced her after discovering she had been slowly draining his bank accounts. The police had investigated her for fraud, but the charges were dropped when witnesses refused to testify. There were also whispers, rumors, never proven, that her first husband's death hadn't been as natural as it appeared, but without evidence, nothing had ever come of the suspicions. Diana had reinvented herself, moved to Texas, changed her name slightly, and started hunting for her next victim. My father, the wealthy widower still grieving his wife, never stood a chance. I printed everything Marcus found: photographs, court documents, interviews with people who had known her before, and I flew to Texas to confront her to show my father the truth about the woman he had married. But I was too late. I landed on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time I reached my father's house the ambulance was already there. Diana was on the front lawn sobbing hysterically while paramedics carried my father out on a stretcher. A sheet pulled over his face. Richard Coleman was dead at 58 years old, and his wife of 10 years was now the sole beneficiary of his $18 million estate. The official cause of death was heart failure brought on by his mysterious chronic illness, the same illness that no doctor had ever been able to properly diagnose. I stood in the hospital corridor staring at the death certificate, and knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at a murder. The police wouldn't investigate. Diana would inherit everything, and my father would be buried without anyone ever knowing what she had done to him, unless I did something about it. I found my father's personal physician, Dr. Morrison, the next day and begged him to order an autopsy. Diana had already signed the paperwork to have my father cremated. The service was scheduled for Saturday, just 4 days away, and once his body was ashes, whatever evidence remained would be destroyed forever. Dr. Morrison was sympathetic, but explained that as the legal next of kin, Diana had complete authority over my father's remains. I would need a court order to stop the cremation, and even then an autopsy would only be performed if there was reasonable suspicion of foul play. I spent the next 36 hours in a blur of legal filings, desperate phone calls, and frantic research. I hired a lawyer named Patricia Chen, who specialized in estate disputes, and she found a judge willing to hear my emergency petition. At 8 a.m. Thursday morning, I presented everything: the symptoms matching arsenic poisoning. Diana suspicious past the pattern of isolation and financial manipulation, the rushed cremation that would destroy all evidence. The judge was skeptical, but something in my testimony, or maybe something in my eyes, convinced her to grant a temporary restraining order. The cremation was halted pending a full autopsy. Diana was furious when she found out. She called me screaming that I was desecrating my father's memory, that I was a jealous, bitter daughter who couldn't accept that her father had moved on after my mother's death. She threatened to sue me for emotional distress, for interference with burial rites, for anything her lawyers could think of, but I didn't care. Let her sue. I knew what she had done, and I was going to prove it. The autopsy results came back 5 days later, and they confirmed everything I had suspected. My father's hair samples showed chronically elevated levels of arsenic consistent with regular small doses administered over a period of 2 to 3 years. His liver and kidneys showed the characteristic damage of long-term arsenic exposure. The medical examiner concluded that Richard Coleman had died of arsenic poisoning and that the manner of death was homicide. I was sitting in Patricia's office when she called me with the news, and I broke down completely. All the months of suspicion and investigation and helpless rage came pouring out of me in sobs that shook my entire body. My father had been murdered by the woman he trusted most, slowly and painfully over years, while I watched from a distance, unable to stop it, unable to save him. I had known the truth in my gut, but hearing it confirmed somehow made it more real, more terrible, more final. The police took Diana's case much more seriously this time. Armed with the autopsy results and Marcus Webb's investigation into her past, they obtained warrants to search the house, her computer, her financial records. What they found was damning traces of arsenic in the tea canisters Diana kept in the kitchen, a receipt for a large quantity of ant poison purchased 3 years earlier, browser searches on her laptop for arsenic poisoning, symptoms, detection methods, and lethal dosages, and most damning of all, a journal Diana had kept documenting my father's declining health in clinical detail, with notes about adjusting dosages based on his responses. She had been experimenting on him, treating his murder like a chemistry project, calibrating her poison to kill him slowly enough that no one would suspect. The district attorney called me personally to inform me that Diana would be arrested, and that given the strength of the evidence she would likely face first-degree murder charges with special circumstances for financial gain. I asked when the arrest would happen, and after a pause she told me the detectives were planning to take Diana into custody at my father's funeral. The service was scheduled for the following day, and Diana had no idea that her performance of grief would be her last. I barely slept that night, running through everything in my mind, wondering if I had done enough, if the evidence would hold up, if Diana might somehow escape justice again the way she had before. Ethan flew in from Chicago to be with me, and we sat together in my hotel room. As the hours crawled by, he held me when I cried, reminded me to eat, and told me over and over that I was doing the right thing, that my father would be proud of me for fighting for him when no one else could. The morning of the funeral was gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was mourning. The service was held at the same church where my parents had been married 30 years earlier, where my mother's funeral had taken place when I was 14. The same stained glass windows cast colored light across the pews, now filled with my father's business associates, neighbors, and friends, people who had watched Diana play the devoted wife for a decade and never suspected the monster hiding behind her gentle smile. Diana sat in the front row dressed in a black designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her makeup was perfect, her hair was perfect, and her grief was perfect, a masterpiece of performance art. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, accepted condolences with trembling grace, and spoke movingly about what a wonderful husband Richard had been, how much she would miss him, how empty her life would be without him. I sat 3 rows behind her, watching the back of her head and waiting. The service was beautiful. I have to admit that the minister spoke about my father's generosity, his love for his family, his dedication to his community, old friends, shared memories of his kindness, his terrible golf game, his infectious laugh. I even stood up and gave a eulogy talking about the father who had taught me to ride a bike, who had held me when my mother died, who had always believed I could accomplish anything I set my mind to. I didn't look at Diana once, but I could feel her eyes on me, calculating, wondering if I suspected anything. After the service, everyone moved to the reception hall for refreshments and more sharing of memories. Diana was working the room like a politician, accepting sympathy and subtle questions about the estate with equal grace. I stood near the door with Ethan, watching the clock, watching Diana, watching the entrance, and then at exactly 2:17 p.m. 2 men in dark suits walked through the door, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. The room fell silent as the detectives approached Diana. One of them, a tall woman with gray-streaked hair, spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Diana Coleman, you are under arrest for the murder of Richard Coleman. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can, and will be used against you in a court of law." The color drained from Diana's face so completely that for a moment I thought she might faint. Her perfectly composed mask cracked, and underneath I saw something I had never seen before. Pure animal terror. She looked around the room, desperately searching for an escape, for an ally, for anyone who might help her. But all she saw were the shocked faces of people who were just beginning to understand what kind of monster had been living among them. "What are you talking about?" Diana stammered, her voice rising to a shriek. "This is insane. I loved Richard the First, took care of him for years. I would never." The detective cut her off. "We have evidence, ma'am. Arsenic found in your kitchen, your purchase records, your internet searches, and your journal documenting his poisoning. You can save your explanations for your lawyer." She turned Diana around and handcuffed her wrists behind her back in front of 200 witnesses, in front of everyone who had ever believed her. Lies. Diana's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the moment she understood I had done this. I had investigated her, exposed her, destroyed her carefully constructed world. Just as she had tried to destroy mine, she opened her mouth to say something, curse me, threaten me, beg me. I'll never know, because the officers were already leading her away, her designer heels clicking on the floor of the reception hall where my father's mourners stood in stunned silence. The room erupted into chaos after she was gone, people crying, asking questions, some even defending Diana, insisting there must be a mistake. But I didn't stay to explain. I walked outside into the gray afternoon and stood by Ethan's side, breathing the cool air and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, not happiness, not satisfaction, just peace. My father was gone, and nothing could bring him back, but the woman who murdered him would never hurt anyone again. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Diana fought every charge with an army of expensive lawyers paid for with my father's money that she had already transferred to her personal accounts. She claimed the arsenic was for pest control, that the journal was a health log she kept out of concern for my father, that the internet searches were for a novel she was thinking about writing someday. The jury didn't believe a word of it. The prosecution presented expert testimony about arsenic poisoning my father's medical records, the pattern of deliberate isolation Diana had imposed on him, and the timeline that showed his health declining in perfect correlation with her arrival in his life. Marcus Webb testified about her past, her previous husband's suspicious death, her pattern of targeting wealthy older men. I testified about watching my father fade away, about Diana's constant control over his medication, his diet, his contact with the outside world, and about finding the truth too late to save him but not too late to deliver justice. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Diana Coleman guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called her crimes calculated, cruel, and motivated by pure greed. Diana showed no emotion as the sentence was read, but as the bailiffs led her away she turned and looked at me one final time, and I saw in her eyes exactly what I had always seen, cold, empty, nothing behind the performance. There never had been anything real about Diana Mitchell or Coleman or whatever her name had been. She was just a predator wearing human skin, and now she would spend the rest of her life in a cage where she belonged. The estate battle took another 2 years. Diana contested everything from prison, filing motion after motion trying to claim her inheritance rights, but Patricia Chen was relentless. In the end, the courts ruled that because Diana had murdered my father, she was legally prohibited from benefiting from his death. The entire $18 million estate passed to me, his only child and rightful heir. I donated $2 million to cancer research in My mother's name another million to organizations that help families recognize signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation, and I used some of the rest to establish the Richard and Margaret Coleman Foundation, which provides forensic investigation services to families who suspect their loved ones are being abused or exploited by caregivers. I'm 32 now, living in Chicago with Ethan. We got married last spring in a small ceremony in my mother's garden, the one Diana had tried to destroy but which I restored after the trial my parents watched from photos on the altar. And I wore my mother's wedding dress, which Diana had hidden in the attic, but never quite managed to throw away. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those years, watching my father die slowly and not understanding what was happening. Sometimes I wake up crying, reaching for him, wanting to warn him, wanting to save him. Ethan holds me through those nights and reminds me that I did save him in the only way I could. I made sure the world knew what happened, and I made sure his killer paid for her crimes. Diana writes me letters from prison, sometimes pages of denial and accusation, claiming I fabricated evidence, that I conspired with the police, that she's the real victim in all of this. I read the first few, then started feeding them straight into the shredder. Her words mean nothing to me now. Her lies have no power. The last thing I heard about her was that she had been denied parole for the 4th time, and that other inmates had discovered what she did, apparently poisoning a sick old man for money. Doesn't win you many friends in prison. I try not to feel satisfaction about that, but I admit I don't try very hard. My father is buried next to my mother now in the cemetery where we used to bring flowers on her birthday. Every year I visit them on holidays on their anniversary, and sometimes just when I miss them, which is often, I tell them about my life, about Ethan, about the foundation we built in their names. I tell them I'm sorry I couldn't save him, and I tell them I hope I made them proud. The wind moves through the trees, and sometimes if I listen carefully, I can almost hear my mother's voice telling me she loves me, and my father's laugh, the way it sounded before Diana took it away from us forever. If you're reading this and something in your life feels wrong, if someone you love is declining in ways that don't make sense, if there's a person controlling their medication, their diet, their access to family and friends, please listen to that feeling. Don't dismiss it the way I almost did. Don't let anyone convince you that you're paranoid or jealous or crazy. Trust your instincts, gather evidence, protect the people you love, and if you're too late like I was, if the person you wanted to save is already gone, know that justice is still possible. It won't bring them back, nothing will, but it will stop the monster from hurting anyone else, and sometimes that has to be enough. My name is Natalie, and 4 years ago I buried my father, a man who was murdered by the woman he trusted most. I couldn't save his life, but I saved his legacy, his memory, and his justice, and every day I try to live in a way that would make him proud to be my father, the way I will always be proud to be his daughter. Diana took so many things from us, our family, our trust, our sense of safety in the world, but she couldn't take the truth, and in the end the truth was enough to destroy her. I think about that sometimes when I'm having a hard day, when grief feels overwhelming, when I miss my parents so much I can barely breathe. The truth was enough, and I was strong enough to find it, and that's something even Diana Coleman, with all her lies and schemes and poison, could never take away from me. Some nights Ethan and I sit on our balcony watching the Chicago skyline and talking about the future, about the children we hope to have someday, about the stories we'll tell them, about their grandparents, about the world we want to build together. He asks me sometimes if I have any regrets, and I always say the same thing: I regret not seeing the truth sooner. I regret every day my father suffered while I was too far away to help, but I don't regret anything I did after I understood what was happening. I don't regret the investigation, the accusations, the legal battles, the moment I stood in that funeral hall and watched Diana's world collapse around her. I don't regret fighting for my father's memory, even when everyone told me to let it go. Some things are worth fighting for even when you've already lost, and my father was worth everything. The last thing I want to say is this: Diana thought she was smarter than everyone else, thought she could manipulate and poison and steal her way through life without consequences. She had gotten away with it before, and she thought she would get away with it again, but she made one mistake. She underestimated the daughter of the man she killed, and that mistake cost her everything: her freedom, her money, her carefully constructed identity, her entire future. Now she sits in a prison cell, growing old and forgotten, while I live the life she tried to steal from me, surrounded by love and purpose, and the memory of parents who made me strong enough to face the darkness and win. My father used to tell me when I was little that the truth always comes out in the end. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes longer, but lies cannot survive forever, because there's always someone willing to dig for the truth, someone who won't give up, someone who loves the victim enough to keep fighting even when it seems hopeless. I became that person for him, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure his death wasn't meaningless. His name lives on in the foundation, in the lives we've helped, in the justice we've brought to families who thought they were alone. Diana wanted to erase him, to take his money and forget he ever existed, but instead she made him immortal, and she made herself a cautionary tale, a monster whose crimes are studied in law schools and forensic academies, a reminder that even the most perfect mask eventually slips. I still have the last birthday card my father ever gave me. He sent it 6 months before he died, and his handwriting was shaky, almost illegible from the tremors Diana's poison had given him, but I can still read it. Dear Natalie, he wrote, I am so proud of the woman you've become. Your mother would be amazed by you. I know I am. Whatever happens, please remember that I love you always and forever. Dad, I keep that card in my nightstand, and I read it whenever I need to remember why I fought so hard, why I risked everything to expose the truth, and why I would do it all again in a heartbeat, because some loves are stronger than death, stronger than lies, stronger than poison, and the love between a father and daughter is the strongest of all. Diana thought she could break that bond with her schemes and manipulation, but she was wrong, dead wrong, and now she has the rest of her life to think about that mistake alone in a cell, while the family she tried to destroy grows stronger every day. That's not revenge, it's justice, and justice in the end is the only thing that lasts.